This happened a few years ago, but I still can't get over it. I'm a real estate agent. It's a career that served me well enough that I was able to afford 2 rental properties by the time I hit my mid-40s. I took pride in managing these properties myself. Did all the cleaning and some minor repairs, mainly because my schedule usually allowed it. Occasionally, I would have to hire someone when my work picked up, but at the time of this story, I was doing it all myself. One of these properties was particularly unique. It was a 2-story house, about an hour's drive away from where I live. This house was split into 2 separate units, with the upper unit comprising 2 bedrooms, a small living room, and a partial kitchen, perfect for short visits or work trips, but not so much for longer stays. It was meant as a short-term rental though, so it was a good investment for a while. I had set up a self-service check-in system for the tenants, which is common practice among hosts. That meant that I rarely had to meet the guests in person. This convenience was especially appreciated during the summer months, when the place was booked up pretty much solid. I would still have to make the trip out there to clean the place up, but not needing to let the guests in usually saved me a trip. On this occasion, the unit was rented out for a weekend, with the guests scheduled to check out on Monday morning. The renter was a woman named Claire. She said it was just her and one other guest that was a friend. I didn't ask any other questions. It was a pretty typical thing. When they were set to check in, I sent a message to make sure everything was okay. I got a quick response from her saying that everything was fine. With that, I figured there was nothing to do, so I worked on other stuff for the rest of the weekend. Given that the property wasn't booked for the days following their stay, I didn't rush out to clean it. I postponed that task until Wednesday evening, when I had some free time. After dinner, I got into my car and drove over to the house. As I unlocked the door and stepped in, I was immediately struck by an overpowering smell of bleach. The air was thick with its pungent scent, and as my eyes swept over the interior, I noticed with some surprise how spotless everything looked. It seemed like there was little left for me to do. There was one exception though. In the corner of the living room, which was a hardwood floor, there was a strange-looking spot. It was a light spot, and given the smell in the room, I thought it was caused by bleach. My curiosity was piqued by the strong smell, and I began a more thorough inspection of the unit. Normally, guests leave behind some mess, a pile of dishes, maybe some trash, but this time, the place was immaculate. It was as if the tenants had never been there at all, except for the lingering chemical scent that filled every room. I found it odd, considering that I don't use bleach for cleaning. It's too harsh, and I found the smell overpowering. I continued to walk around the place, starting with the bedrooms. The beds were made perfectly, not a crease in sight, and the floors were clean to a degree that seemed almost professional. In the small living room, the cushions were arranged neatly on the couch, and the partial kitchen looked untouched, with not a single utensil out of place. It was eerie how clean everything was. Then I reached the bathroom, and I checked under the sink for the cleaning supplies. It was part of my routine, and if there was anything that needed to be replaced, then I would make note of that. Again, it seemed that the stuff was not touched. Kinda surprising, since they had obviously cleaned the place. They must have brought their own stuff, I thought, but that just made it even more strange. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. I obviously thought there was something they were covering up, like a crime scene cleanup or something. I walked back out to the living room, took a closer look at the light spot in the corner. It was almost definitely caused by a large amount of bleach. It was probably at least a dinner plate-sized patch on the wooden floor, and it was totally ruined. After taking a closer look at that, I stepped out onto the street and called the police. When they came, they looked around for a while and agreed that it was weird, but without anything solid, it was just a feeling. They asked me for more information about my guests, and I was happy to give it to them. After that, I went home for the night, but took the place off the market for a while. When the police eventually got back to me, they said the guests admitted to cleaning the place with bleach, but they had an excuse. They claimed that they were partying, and somebody drank too much and made a mess. They cleaned it up to be respectful to me. I found that hard to believe, and it didn't explain the spot on the floor, which would be permanent damage, and I would have to have it repaired. In the end, I couldn't prove anything against them, but I was reimbursed for the damage to the floor. I still think they did something weird in my place, but I haven't been able to prove what it was. When my wife and I first started dating, we were both living downtown in a large city. I had a small bachelor apartment. My wife Crystal had a condo that she shared with her best friend from college. Neither of us loved the city life, but being a few years out of college at the time, there wasn't much choice. We needed to be there for work. Once things became more serious between the two of us, we started to plan a weekend away together. We would usually use Airbnb and had several nice trips to spots outside of the city. Her roommate had a car and was pretty generous about letting us use it. We ended up booking a small cottage on a vineyard one weekend. The place looked perfect for a quiet couple of days together. Before our trip, the owner sent us a combination for a lockbox that was attached to the cottage so we could access the keys ourselves. He also mentioned that he'd be happy to give us a tour of the vineyard, which we thought sounded interesting. I messaged him back, letting him know that we would be happy to have the tour, but I let him know that it was no pressure. We were looking forward to the trip either way. It was really just a bonus if that worked out. The owner seemed eager to show us around though, so it sounded good. We arrived at the cottage late in the afternoon on Friday. The lockbox was right where the owner said it would be, so we easily got the keys and let ourselves in. It was exactly as advertised, cozy, with just enough space for the two of us. It was just one bedroom, which was actually just the far corner of the cottage. It had a large curtain for a door, but since it was just the two of us, we always left it open. There was a futon in the living room, and the kitchen was right behind it. There was a small kitchen table there, just big enough for two. After we had a chance to unpack and settle in, we spent the rest of the evening relaxing on the porch. The main house, where the owner presumably lived, was in clear view, but we hadn't seen anyone since we arrived. There was a pickup truck parked in front of it though, so we figured he was home. Neither of us wanted to bother him that night, because we were too tired as well. We both thought it would be better to do the tour another time. After about an hour, we finally saw someone come out of the main house. It was a man, and he locked the door, then walked to the truck and drove away. I assumed he was the owner, maybe heading out for some reason. It was about 9 p.m. and not quite dark, so we could see the man, although from a distance. He was a younger man than we were expecting, probably mid-30s to 40s with long black hair. We didn't think much of it and went inside, planning to ask for the vineyard tour the next day. The next morning, we woke up, excited to explore the area. After a quick breakfast, we walked over to the main house, expecting to find the owner and take him up on his offer. However, no one answered our knocks, and the house seemed dead quiet. We walked around for a bit, but there was no sign of him. We also noticed that the truck from the previous night was not back. That seemed unusual to the both of us, because he definitely lived there. That day, we decided to explore on our own. We went for a drive on one of the country roads and then had lunch in town. We stopped at one of the grocery stores to get ingredients for dinner, and we returned to the cottage, cooked, and ate. Then we opened a bottle of wine and sat on the porch. By then we noticed the pickup truck was back. While we were out there, I saw that same man come outside the house again, so I got up and walked over to him. The following was a tense conversation that was really confusing to me. "Hey, how's it going?" I said to him. He turned around and looked startled. Good," he said, then turned back around as if trying to ignore me. "Are we still doing the tour?" I asked. The man turned back around looking confused. "Yeah, we can do it maybe tomorrow or the next day," he mumbled, but I really think he had no idea what I was talking about. Then I smiled and turned away and went back to the cottage. My girlfriend and I talked for a while. We tried calling and texting the owner's number, but he never answered or replied. My girlfriend then suggested checking the vineyard's website for a contact number, thinking we might have better luck reaching someone else who could help us. It seemed to be a small operation though, and the only number we could find was the one we already had. That's when she stumbled upon a photo of the owner, and the man that we had seen leaving the house wasn't him. This realization brought a new wave of confusion. Who had we seen? And more importantly, where was the actual owner? With that, we decided it was time to call the police and report our concerns. We explained the situation to the police over the phone, and it wasn't long before they showed up. They wandered around the property for a while, but I don't think they went inside the main house. We didn't get any closure right away, and eventually the cops left. We wanted to file a missing person report on the owner, but they wouldn't let us. We had never actually seen him after all. Things were incredibly suspicious though, and we were uncomfortable. The police asked us not to touch anything or go near the main house as they continued their investigation. They also tried to contact the owner using the details we had from the Airbnb booking and the vineyard's website. The next day, we decided to leave, and we didn't see that truck again. We followed up with the police about a week later, and the owner was finally reported missing. I went back to give a full description of the man we had seen on the property. As far as I know, the case was never solved, and eventually we moved on and let it go. I still don't know what happened at that place, or who that strange guy was. I had been an Airbnb host for a couple years without any major issues. My place was in a quiet neighborhood, and I actually used to live there full time. It was a townhouse with 2 bedrooms, and it was a bit out of the way from my work. I ended up getting an apartment in the city to avoid the commute. Instead of selling the house, I decided to rent it out short term. Since I had lived there before, I knew some of the neighbors, and I always tried to be respectful of them. My nearest neighbors had my number, and I encouraged them to let me know if there were any problems with any of my guests, parties being the most common issue. It had happened a few times that I needed to kick people out early for disrespectful behavior, or just generally being a nuisance. One time, I rented out the place to a group of a few guys who were in town for a wedding. They ended up bringing 20 or 30 people back to my house for an after party that went until 5 in the morning. At that point, one of my neighbors called the cops. I kicked them out the next day and gave them a bad review. This story focuses on a different incident though, and this one is much, much worse. One weekend, I rented out my place to a group that seemed okay at first. They were a young group of 2 guys and 2 girls, and they mentioned they were in town for a music festival. I had electronic locks, so I didn't need to see them when they checked in, just sent a message to make sure everything was fine. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from my next-door neighbor. She was the kind to never complain without a good reason, so I knew immediately that something was off. She said that there was a loud party at the house. But what really worried me was that she said there was a loud bang that she thought could have been a gunshot. I was worried, but didn't think there could have actually been a shooting there. My first thought was that it was a firecracker or something like that. If they were messing around with fireworks in my house though, then that would be troubling too. Not like a gunshot though. As I made it onto the street and my house came into sight, nothing looked off right away. There was a single car in the driveway, and I could see that the lights were on. I parked on the street and turned off my car, and then I looked over into the window. There were at least a few people that I could see from the front window, at least 4 or 5 of them, but nothing too crazy. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. Approaching my front door, I could hear some music, and it was pretty loud. My neighbor was definitely not making it up. I should mention that it was past midnight, and that in that neighborhood, noise restrictions began at 10 p.m. I rang the doorbell and waited, but nobody answered. They surely couldn't hear me, but I tried again anyway, and I waited for another few minutes. Then suddenly, the front door swung open, and a man almost plowed into me as he rushed out of the house. We were both shocked to see each other, because I think he was just coming out for some other reason, maybe to smoke. I did recognize him from his profile picture, and I knew he was the one who actually rented the place. I tried to talk to him, but he was pretty drunk. I told him that one of the neighbors complained about the noise, and I wanted to warn them before the police got involved. I tried to make it sound like I was on their side, and just doing them a favor by coming. That didn't seem to work though, and things got hostile pretty quickly. It wasn't long before this guy was getting in my face. We were standing on the porch with the front door wide open, but the guy was blocking my way back to my car. The only way to get away from him would have been to go into the house, but there were more of them in there, and they all looked drunk. I would guess that there were less than 10 people in total, though. From the corner of my eye, I saw another man coming towards us from inside the house. I didn't recognize this man, but he was big, and he looked rough. He was older than the others, and he had long hair and a bushy beard. He was overweight but strong looking, and was probably around 6 feet tall. As soon as he stepped out onto the porch, I saw that he had a handgun tucked into his pants, right at the front. Right then, I remembered what my neighbor told me about a possible gunshot. Both of them stood in front of me. They were cornering me in the space between my front door and the wall. I just want everybody to calm down and leave, I said. My main goal was to de-escalate the situation safely. The man with the gun then pulled his firearm out and waved it around, not pointing it directly at anyone, but making a clear threat. I still don't know what they wanted me to do. I think they were just pissed off that I told them to keep it down. Both of them reminded me of some guys I used to know who always tried to fight everyone when drinking. It didn't seem to matter what happened. If they were drinking, then they would try to pick a fight with someone. That's what this was like. Realizing the danger was beyond anything I could handle, I slowly backed away and said, "It's all good, I'm just gonna go." I went back to my car and then drove around the block and called the cops. They were able to break up the party, and while they were there, they smelled weed, so they searched the house for drugs. I heard they found a lot more than weed when they went in. That's not the end of it though. The bang noise that my neighbor heard was in fact a gunshot. Later the next day, after my guests were either arrested or kicked out, I found a bullet hole in my floor. That must have been what caused the noise. I still don't know if it was intentional or if it was a drunken accident, but it's scary either way. Those people were dangerous, and I wish I never let them into my house. I have a creepy story about an Airbnb where I lived for a while. I got transferred to a different city for my job when I was still new. It wasn't much of a choice for me. I could have said no, I guess, but the implication was that I had to go. The job started immediately, and there wasn't enough time to hunt for an apartment, so I turned to Airbnb as a temporary solution, booking a whole house that was old and reasonably priced. One of the good things about my company was that they did give me a budget for the move, so I was basically living for free. I would have a lot more space than where I was coming from, too. I booked the place for a whole month up front, but the host told me that I could extend it with at least a week's notice, otherwise he might rent it to someone else. I was going to use that month to find a more long-term place, or maybe renew for a while. It was a quiet neighborhood, but close to some good spots in the city. The commute to work was also short, at just 15 minutes. The house itself was small, but more than enough for me, because I was single at the time. It had an extra bedroom that I never used, and of course, it was fully furnished. On my first day, the host briefly mentioned the basement, telling me that it was mainly used for storage, and he told me that I could use it if I wanted. Being an old house though, the basement was pretty much unusable for anything else. I went down there once just to check it out, and the ceiling was probably about 5 feet high. The floor was cracked concrete, and the walls were cinder blocks. It had a few windows that barely let in a few rays of dusty light. Also, there were different rooms down there, but I didn't explore too much. The days passed uneventfully as I settled into my new routine. I was focusing on my job and also searching for a permanent place. After a couple of weeks, I was still spending most of my free time at home. I had set up my computer at the kitchen table and kind of used that as my desk and gaming setup. That's where I was spending most of my time in the evenings. One night when I was on my computer, I heard a noise in the house. It was definitely more than a creak, and it sounded like it was coming from the basement. I got up and walked around the house for a minute, hoping it would happen again, and eventually, it did. It was like a light tapping sound, but it was not consistent. What really worried me at the time was that it could be rats. The last thing I wanted was to think that there could be rats down there in that basement. It would be way too much hassle to get out of there and find a new place, so I had to check it out to find out what was going on. If it was nothing, then I had to know. I headed towards the basement door, which was just off the kitchen. It had an antique lock, but I don't think it actually worked. I didn't have the key anyway. I turned the knob and opened the door. First thing I noticed when it was open was a rush of cold air coming from down the stairs. It was late fall, so the weather was getting cold, but even though the house didn't have great insulation, it was way too cold. I couldn't explain that at the time. The stairs creaked under my weight as I went down, and when I was about halfway to the bottom, I could see the single bulb hanging in the middle of the main room. The basement was larger than I remembered, and it was mostly empty, but there were a few boxes in one of the far corners, the owner's stuff I assumed. I walked around for a while, but didn't find much. It was still cold though. When I got to the far corner of the basement, I saw that one of the small windows was open. I didn't even know they could open up until then. I walked over to it to get a closer look, but when I reached up to close it, a pair of shoes appeared right in front of me. Out of instinct, I pulled my arm back, then backed up and moved around a corner. I peeked over as a pair of legs started climbing through the window. I had seen enough, and I ran up the stairs. I grabbed a few important things before leaving out the front door. I'm pretty sure I had somebody living in that basement, possibly the whole time I was there. I called the owner and told him what happened. He called the police, and the person was taken out as I watched from the other side of the sidewalk. I had no intention of moving back into that house, but I did still want to go in and get the rest of my stuff. Once it was all taken care of, I went back in with the owner. He went down to the basement to check how this could have happened. I was given a refund for the time that I didn't stay at that place, and that was enough to get a different place on Airbnb. I wasn't thrilled about using the app again after this experience, but something like that really could have happened anywhere. It was more on the owner for not securing the windows. You can't really blame Airbnb. Back in the year 2015, I was living with my now ex-girlfriend. We started off in a long-distance relationship, but eventually I moved to be with her. She already had a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate who was planning to move out. Therefore, it worked out pretty well for me to move right in. I'll spare you some of the details, but it didn't go very well. We fought a lot right from the beginning, and it was seeming like things were not going to work out. Living together was a big change for us. After one particularly bad fight, I opened up my laptop looking for another place to stay. I wasn't planning to leave for good at the time, but I knew that we needed a break from each other. Since I didn't know anybody else in the city, I was checking online listings for short-term rooms. The one I ended up settling on was from Airbnb. It was a basement room in a house that was split up into 8 separate units. Kitchens were shared for each floor, but my room did have its own private bathroom. It was cheap, which is why I chose it, but I knew it was in a rough neighborhood. In the pictures, I could see that there was a small window in the upper part of the wall that had metal bars on it. I booked it right there, and then went to sleep on the couch in the living room, since my girlfriend had kicked me out of the bed. In the morning, I went to work and brought most of my stuff, so I wouldn't have to go back to the apartment. At lunchtime, I texted my girlfriend to tell her that I was moving out for a while. I didn't even get a response, but I knew she was probably mad. Once I was done with work, I took the bus to the Airbnb. As expected, the neighborhood was rough looking. One thing that I noticed was that every house had metal bars on at least the lower windows, but some even had them on the second floor ones too. I got the idea that crime was a problem in the area, so I was hoping that I wouldn't have to stay long. I booked the place for a week, but I was hoping to smooth things over with my girlfriend before then. It was a hot summer, and even though I was in the basement, it was still really warm in my room, so I kept the window open for some semblance of a breeze. One night at around midnight, I was lying in bed with my laptop propped up on my knees. I had my headphones in, and I was just screwing around and watching some show. The outside noises were muffled by my over-ear headphones, but without them, the street noise would have been really loud. Suddenly, a shadow appeared over my window, blocking the glow that was pouring in from the streetlights. At first, I thought it was just somebody walking by, but then an arm reached through the barred window. I yanked my headphones off in disbelief, and I heard a voice over the ambient roar of the traffic from the busy street. "Let me in," it said. I backed away, unable to form any words, not that I would want to. I was still hoping that he didn't actually see me. Maybe if I got out of view and stayed quiet, then he would leave me alone. I knew he couldn't get through the bars, so I still felt safe. But then, the arm withdrew. I stayed on the other side of the room, still watching the small window. Not more than 10 seconds later, the man stuck his arm back in, but this time, he was holding a gun. He was waving it around frantically, and every time it pointed towards me, I was afraid that I would be shot. The man was still screaming for me to let him in, as if I could just open the bars. I obviously wouldn't have even if I could. The door was right next to me, so I slipped out and closed it quietly. In the hallway outside my room, I paused, my mind racing. The gravity of the situation hit me hard. Here I was, in a strange house and a rough neighborhood, with a man trying to force his way into my window. That was the first time I'd ever had a gun pointed towards me. My first thought was to escape, but then what? Go outside to where the gunman was? Luckily, I had taken my phone with me, so I took it out and dialed 911, then whispered what was happening. They were sending the cops and said they would be there in less than 5 minutes. I stayed there on the far end of the hallway, just a few feet away from the door to my room. About a minute later, I heard a thud, not the explosive sound I feared a gunshot would make, but something heavy hitting the floor. Silence followed, and I strained to hear over my breathing. When the police did arrive, I had never felt more relieved. I directed them to the room, my voice barely above a whisper. By that time, they had already secured the outside area of the house, and there was nobody at my window, but I was still wondering what happened in that room. When the cops checked it, they did in fact find a handgun that must have been dropped in. That crazy guy stuck his gun into my window and dropped it onto my floor. Could have easily gone off and killed me, but I was out of the room by then. The worst part about it was that the guy was never caught. The gun was unregistered and definitely illegal, so it didn't trace back to anybody. I thought the fingerprints would help, but I never found out why that didn't work. Most of the criminals in that area should have been on record, but maybe that guy wasn't for some reason. The point is that I lived in that place for another few days, knowing he was still out there. I kept that window closed for the rest of the time I was there. I did eventually move back in with my girlfriend, but things didn't get much better. She was really mad at me for leaving without talking about it first, and our relationship never recovered. I ended up moving back home only about a month later, and left that whole city behind, forever.